Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio if you're listening live or on catch-up, the Byline Times podcast. This time, the fines handed out to Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Chancellor Rishi Sunak for breaking COVID lockdown rules. Should both men now resign after previously having denied attending parties? Johnson, the first serving PM to be punished for breaking the law, initially said that guidelines were followed at all times. He told Parliament that he thought a drinks party he attended in the Downing Street garden was a work event. Sunak told Parliament last December, "I did not attend any parties." Labour leader Keir Starmer has called for Johnson to go. But Tory MPs are already circling the wagons, seeking to protect their leader, despite the fact that he broke the law at a time when families of those who died from COVID couldn't always comfort their loved ones in hospital or attend their funerals. North Thanet MP Roger Gale, who called for Johnson to resign earlier this year, said now is not the time because of the war in Ukraine. Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross, who previously said lying to Parliament and breaking the ministerial code is a straight red, has also said now is not the time. In a moment, we'll hear from Safiah Ngah, whose dad died from COVID-19, and Sam Bright from Byline Times. But I'd also welcome your reaction as well. If you're listening live on your phone, in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little microphone icon. You can tap that to request access. And if you've got something interesting to contribute or a question to ask, then by all means, we'll be glad to let you on. And before we get cracking as well, just a reminder that Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast come from the Byline Times. There are no oligarchs or corporate interests behind us, no proprietor telling us what to say. We are funded by ordinary people like you, which means we can report without fear or favour. If you're interested in taking out a subscription to the monthly Byline Times newspaper, head over to our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com, where you can find details of how to subscribe. That's at bylinetimes.com. Let's get a word with Safiah Ngah then, whose dad, Dr. Zahari Ngah, died from COVID in February 2021. Safiah, welcome to Byline Radio. How are you doing? You all right?
Hi, yeah, I'm not too bad, thanks. I think whenever these revelations come out about the government, it's always a particularly difficult time for bereaved family members. You know, it's another reminder of the trauma that we've experienced and just a reminder that other people weren't playing by the rules when we were and our family members were dying.
Absolutely. And I know you've spoken about this before on Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast. Just tell us a little bit about your dad, Dr. Zahari Ngah, how he passed away and also how much he contributed to society before that.
Yeah, so my dad was a Malaysian national. He moved to the UK in the 70s to study and he trained as his full job title is a bit of a mouthful. He was a clinical psychologist and a child and adult psychotherapist. And he worked for the NHS for nearly 40 years. So he gave a great deal to this country. And he was 68 years old. He had no underlying health conditions. And during the second wave of COVID, and the numbers were obviously appalling at that stage. I remember reading that there were 1 in 20 people in the area that my parents lived in central London who had COVID. And my brother and I were doing the shopping for my parents because we couldn't get a delivery slot. And we picked up COVID in a supermarket. It was the only place we'd been to, so it's the only possibility. And we unfortunately gave COVID to my dad. And Dad was okay for about a week. Eventually he started kind of coughing up blood. So he was called into the hospital. And even that, you know, this was the height of the second wave. My mum dropped him into the hospital and, said to the nurse what was happening. And she was told, get out as quickly as you can because she didn't have COVID at that time. And that's the last time that we saw my dad. And the whole experience was incredibly traumatic. Like my dad had never been in hospital in my living memory, and he was incredibly anxious, not having his friends, his family members around him. And I feel so guilty about that. So kind of reading about this and hearing about it and how the government were not just breaking their own rules, but celebrating at a time where, you know, families were mourning in their and they're tens of thousands. It's deeply disrespectful, but it's also just brings up really painful memories.
And in terms of your dad's passing away, Safiah, were you able to comfort him in those dying hours?
I wish that I could have. I was sort of we were messaging him on WhatsApp before he was intubated, and he was sort of trying to, I suppose, protect us from what was really happening and the decisions that he was obviously having to make. We then had a video call with him before he was intubated, and my dad, he was an intelligent man and he really valued his mind, and he really, really didn't want to be intubated because he knew that some of the effects of intubation could lead to, not being as sound of mind. And he eventually messaged us one morning and said that he said, I've decided to go for intubation, which really was his way of saying that I think that was the only option. And we had a video call with him where he could barely speak. So we tried to keep talking. And so it makes me quite emotional to think about it because it's the last time I spoke to my dad. And then he was intubated and he died just under a week later. So no, in answer to your question, no, I didn't get to be with him.
That's so sad, Safiah, listening to that story. And I don't want to exploit your grief in any way, but it is that sense that many people will have had who lost loved ones. I know I've spoken to Nazir Afzal, the former Chief Crown Prosecutor for North West England, who lost a brother in similar circumstances. And I think people understood at the times that there had to be rules about observing how many people there were around bedsides, around funerals and so on.
Yeah.
But to find out that the Prime Minister and his Chancellor broke those same rules, I can't imagine how that must feel for you.
Yeah, it's disturbing. It seems very perverse that the people that were implementing these life-saving rules weren't obeying them. And I think, it's not kind of speaking about it. It doesn't feel like exploiting it, because I think really it's important that people hear our stories as bereaved family members, because it's easy to sort of, at this point at this stage in the pandemic, we're almost moving on from COVID, or there's a big desire to move on from COVID. But these stories bring up a really deep and unresolved trauma for us. And actually, we will be, quote unquote, living with COVID. And what does that mean? The government have shown very little indication that they care about people that maybe have disabilities or health issues that mean that living with COVID isn't really an option. But actually, we really need to be thinking about that. But we can't rely on this government, unfortunately, because they don't obey by the rules and they don't appear to care. There's a real disconnect between them and the people of this country.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Safiah, if I may. Thank you for your contribution so far. Let's bring in Sam Bright from Byline Times, Chief Investigations Reporter. Sam, we've heard Safiah's story there, and tragically there will be many, many, many more of those. But as I mentioned in the introduction, some Conservative MPs who previously called for Johnson to go are already circling the wagons around him to protect him at the moment.
Yeah, it's looking quite uncertain at the minute whether, the precise mood of the party. But as you said, the initial indications are that that he's going to survive this one. Both him and Sunak are going to survive this one, which is, it's grim. It's grim seeing that headline on your phone that says that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have broken the law, and yet there's no trigger in the British political system that removes them from office, or an inquiry is held, or as in the United States, where Parliament, Congress, in their case, can decide whether to retain those in power. It's essentially up to the mood of the Conservative Party whether to hold a no confidence vote or not in Johnson and to boot him out, or up to his personal moral convictions as to whether he should stay or not. And you get the sense that if this were a month ago, 6 weeks ago, at the sort of peak of the media uproar over these various stories, then he would have gone. But that the Ukraine war has really has changed the dynamic within British politics. Sadly, it has to be said, in Johnson's favour.
And that was one of the reasons that Roger Gale, the Conservative MP, gave for not seeking Johnson's resignation now. He said there will be a reckoning later, but he said that it would play to Vladimir Putin's agenda to destabilise the United Kingdom at the moment. Now, is there an argument that there is something to that, notwithstanding the understandable grief and anger of families like Safiah's?
I mean, I don't see how Conservative MPs can say that Putin is an irrational actor, and then on the other hand, second guess what Vladimir Putin is thinking about Partygate. Those two things don't seem to go together. For one, I think there's also a convincing argument to be made that that this undermines the British regime, both domestically. It will lose yet more public support. It will fall in the polls, and as a result, it will lose credibility on an international stage as well. Not necessarily in terms of Vladimir Putin necessarily, but I'm thinking more in terms of our close allies. That America, Germany, France may just end up seeing Boris Johnson as a lame duck, and that certainly damages our clout on an international stage. I think there's also been the argument that there aren't any viable contenders, certainly after the week that Rishi Sunak has had, and the fact that he's now caught up in the fines. He's been sort of eliminated from the race. And the Conservative Party, which is, perhaps something that you can't hold against them for thinking, is that there's just no one else to step up and lead the nation at this time. Not that Boris Johnson can do it particularly well, but nobody else can either.
It's no news that Boris Johnson is a liar, but in this instance, he has lied to Parliament. So too has Rishi Sunak. And I suppose for those people arguing that it would destabilise the British political system if we replace the Prime Minister at a time of invasion in Ukraine, it could also be argued, couldn't it, that it's destabilising to keep at the head of our democratically elected government someone who has misled his colleagues and who has misled the public.
Well, exactly, and it's repeated. It's repeated lies on behalf of Boris Johnson. It's been shown now that he went before Parliament and he said multiple things. He said that the parties didn't happen. Then he said that no rules were broken. He said that he was appalled by some of his advisors seeming to joke about the parties when he was involved in them. He was, the one being ambushed by a cake. And lest we forget, this isn't one or two parties. The Met Police investigation is ongoing, and there are dozens of events that were held in Downing Street and along Whitehall during the various lockdown periods. And so he can't throw it off as an isolated incident either. This was systemic rule breaking, law breaking on behalf of the highest people in the land. And all that he's going to have to show for it is a paltry fine, it seems, at this stage, which is utterly appalling and a damning indictment, I think, of our political system.
Safiah, I asked this question in all sort of due respect. Do you think the fact that we are supporting Ukraine at this time of invasion by Russia, do you think that makes any difference to Boris Johnson's position, notwithstanding the terrible ordeal that you've been through?
Not particularly. I think I've seen a lot of people say that, we had a change of prime ministers during World War II, and that wasn't to do with law breaking. So arguably it's even more important this time. Obviously, Ukraine is a really big issue and we need strong leadership. I don't think, and I think it's a widely shared opinion that Boris Johnson has already proved that he's incapable of leadership at times when we need that leadership the most. So I think actually it's arguably even more important that we make that decision and we make it very quickly, and that Boris Johnson resigns as soon as possible.
You think he should go now, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I made this point to Sam, really, the other side of that debate saying that he can't go now is that if we're to stand, we as the United Kingdom, as part of this sort of network of nations that believe in democracy and accountability for our politicians, you could argue it makes it even more important that Johnson goes, actually. If he's found to have lied to Parliament, if he's found to have broken the laws that he, as Prime Minister, was responsible for setting, if he were toppled, that wouldn't say that we are weak, in my view. That would say we are strong because nobody is above the law. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is exactly how it should be. I just think Boris Johnson has had so many chances at this point. And personally, I don't think that Boris Johnson is a great figurehead for this country. I think he makes us look like a laughingstock. And I don't really believe that losing his leadership at this time will be particularly damaging. Obviously, he has been to Ukraine and he's met with Volodymyr Zelensky at this point. But I really think that the sooner the better. You know, his cabinet is not, I wouldn't say that I'm particularly enthusiastic about any of his cabinet and anyone that could replace him. But I really just think he's been the most appalling leader for the past 2 years, and we need to learn from our mistakes at this point. Sam, it's a really difficult moment, isn't it, for the United Kingdom? But if Boris Johnson were to go, I suppose I repeat the point I made to Safiah there. It would say to the world, wouldn't it, that nobody is above the law. Even if Johnson, the polls show, is not a particularly well-loved Prime Minister, but even if it were the case that he were a well-loved Prime Minister, the fact that you cannot lie to Parliament, the fact that you cannot get away with breaking the law would, I think, send a message to other countries that might look to the UK as some kind of beacon, hard though it may be for us to imagine that at the moment.
Well, exactly. I think in terms of domestic and international politics, you feel as though a marker has got to be put down by somebody to protect democracy and the rule of law. There's been, a really dangerous slippage in recent years towards authoritarianism among Western democracies. We saw it in the case of Trump and his denials that he ever lost the last election to Joe Biden. We see in France the perilous rise of the far right, which could yet sweep power in a week's time. And in the UK, we've got this constitutional order where things are done by tradition and where we leave ourselves vulnerable because we assume that those in power are always going to be good chaps playing by the rules. We essentially have an unwritten system whereby the powerful hold themselves to account. So the ministerial code, which is supposed to govern the actions of ministers, the person in charge of enforcing that is the Prime Minister, which is just indicative of the sort of system that we've got. And so it's a case that we have to rely on the individual moral convictions of those seated in power in this country in order to prevent a similar decline towards authoritarianism. I don't think we're ever going to slip towards the sort of despotic regimes that we caricature. But it's seriously the case that we've got a democracy in crisis at the minute, in large part thanks to Boris Johnson's lies and his rule breaking, precisely because our constitutional arrangement allows for it to be so.
The timing of these fixed penalty notices, I think is quite interesting as well. Let's remember that the Metropolitan Police, under its previous commissioner, Cressida Dick, initially declined to investigate these offences. Though we were told that they were too long ago, and it was only when the Sue Gray investigation was commissioned, Sue Gray being the senior civil servant who was tasked with investigating these matters, it was only then that the Metropolitan Police decided to investigate. Now, of course, Cressida Dick has now gone because she lost the confidence of the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan. It may well be a pure coincidence, but Cressida Dick only officially retired yesterday, and the day after news of these fines emerges. Some people might see that there's something relevant and pertinent in that. At the same time, the fact that the news of these fines has come out now means that it comes out during a parliamentary recess where, quite conveniently for the Prime Minister and his Chancellor, there is no opportunity to grill them immediately about what's happened.
Exactly. And you look at each of the establishments that are tasked with upholding democracy in this case. Parliament, like you say, it's in recess, so it's not able to do it in this case. In other circumstances anyway, Parliament is able to ask questions of the Prime Minister, but it's not able to meaningfully hold him to account to any great extent. It can essentially cause him embarrassment, but it can't remove him from office unless the Conservative Party chooses to do so, which it hasn't. You've got, like you say, the police who were very reticent about getting involved in this whole process. I believe the Good Law Project again had a hand in turning it towards investigating the Downing Street parties. Then you've got the Cabinet Office and Sue Gray, who was commissioned to produce this report, which has been months in the making. And of course, she produced an update prior to the Metropolitan Police getting involved. But we haven't seen the full details of the Sue Gray report. There were suggestions from ITV, which has led the investigation on this, that she provided the opportunity for civil servants to corroborate what they had said to her and the questionnaires that they submitted to the Metropolitan Police to ensure that there weren't any discrepancies, which, I mean, that seems to be a bit of an inside job in itself. And then you've got the final arm of democracy, which is the media, which, to be fair, despite the many, many problems that there are in the media that we've catalogued over the years, it has, certain journalists, particularly Pippa Creer at the Mirror and certain journalists at ITV have done a sterling job in exposing these parties. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be hearing about them at all. And so essentially our democracy is hanging on at this stage. The public's access to knowledge is hanging on to a few journalists being annoying enough to those in power to bring these sort of details to light.
Yeah, you mentioned the Sue Gray report, because I should clarify that a version of it has been published. She published some initial findings. She said that there were 16 events, 12 of which have been investigated by the Metropolitan Police. Sue Gray discovered 3 events that had not previously been reported, but the full version of the report is currently not published because of the Metropolitan Police's investigation, which many people felt was launched at a very convenient time because it kind of kicked the full publication of the report into the long grass where it currently remains. Safiah, you are a member of a pressure group, COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. Where does that battle go from here?
Well, it's ongoing. So the main aim of the group at the moment is to shape the terms of reference for the inquiry. So we've been pushing for the inquiry for a good 2 years now. And now that we've appointed a chair, we're speaking to the chair to consult on specific areas of the terms of reference. So the government put out a proposed terms of reference last month, and lots of key parts of that didn't cover experiences of bereaved family members and people that were closely involved with the pandemic. So we've been meeting, bereaved family members up and down the country have been meeting with the chair of the inquiry to kind of advise what we think should be included or reinstated into the terms of reference.
And this is Baroness Hallett, isn't she? She's chairing the investigation. And one thing I know that, and you mentioned this right at the start about your dad having come from Malaysia, one thing that you're very keen for her to examine is the disproportionate impact of COVID on minority communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, my dad was Malaysian, and we know it's a well-known fact that that COVID has affected minority ethnic groups disproportionately. And, you know, I've seen that from the perspective of my dad. My dad was obviously Malaysian. He had no underlying health conditions. But when we went to his funeral, they had opened, he was buried at a Muslim cemetery. He was Muslim, and they'd opened a completely new section of the cemetery to deal with the number of bodies that were coming in every day. We watched as diggers dug up his grave in front of us, because that was a time-saving mechanism that had been employed to deal with how many people were dying and going to that cemetery. And my dad's grave, you know, will eventually be landscaped, but at the moment it is one amongst hundreds of graves that are just mounds of earth with sticks of wood sticking out, with his name and the coordinates of his grave handwritten on. So I use that example just because it's a very clear indication of how much COVID has affected the Muslim community, and we know that it has disproportionately affected all Black and minority ethnic groups in this country. And it's a well-known fact. It's just not often the topic of conversation. You know, the government's parties and mishandlings of the pandemic often get more sort of traction in the media, which is fair enough. But it's really, really, really important that is at the forefront of the inquiry, because we must understand why that's the case.
And that incident you describe of watching the diggers dig up your dad's grave whilst you are there mourning his loss, that is trauma upon trauma.
It's a weird, it's a strange thing, because I know sort of saying that to you, that is a pretty shocking thing to say, but I actually, on the day of his funeral, there was so much going on. It was so unexpected that he died. You know, as I said, he was relatively young, and he had no underlying health conditions. But yeah, it was a really, really strange thing to see, and it's completely fair enough on behalf of the people that run the cemetery. You know, they had to deal with an incredible number of bodies coming in every day, and that was all that they could do. But yeah, it is, and that's another thing that we are sort of pushing to be covered in the inquiry. It's not in the government's terms of reference, but we've asked for it to be included, that the lack of support for bereaved family members who, you know, it is an incredibly traumatic thing to lose somebody to COVID, and to keep reliving that trauma every time we hear about, you know, these parties in the news, or COVID is just, it's a topic of conversation. Everyone talks about it all the time. You know, how are you doing? Weather's nice. And then something about COVID, you know, we all talk about it, and it's lighthearted, and I understand that, but there needs to be some sort of support in place for bereaved family members, because some people have lost their only partner, and it is a hugely sudden and traumatic loss.
Since your father's passing, and in recent months, we've moved to a situation now where the official attitude, certainly in England anyway, is that of living with COVID as well. I just wonder if you have any observations on that, given that that is very much of the ideological mindset of Boris Johnson. And right at the start of COVID, we know the government was slow to lock down. They've been keener in England to, in inverted commas, move away from lockdown restrictions than they have in other parts of the United Kingdom. How does that feel to you?
I find it quite offensive, and I find it very worrying. From my personal perspective, you know, my family members and me have all been vaccinated, and I don't personally have any sort of health vulnerabilities, but as a bereaved family member and someone that has experienced acutely how dangerous COVID can be, I'm extremely concerned. I still wear my mask kind of everywhere I go, and no one else really does anymore. I find that really worrying, and I do hold a lot of anxiety sort of going out because of that. And then, when we talk about living with COVID, it's a very broad statement because people have to live with COVID from very different base points. Some people are living with COVID who are already vulnerable to a disease like COVID, but there's no measures in place to protect people like that. And that's the real problem with this government, I think, because we move forward, but there's no actual strategy behind moving forward. And I really hope, who knows what will happen to Boris Johnson, but I think anything is better than this government that just barrels into these situations without thinking. And lives, we have one of the worst death rates in the world, and we've lost so many people. And I know that is in the past, but we must move forward with some introspection and some kind of thought process about how we protect people going forward.
Sam, I mentioned Roger Gale, the Conservative MP for Thanet North, saying now is not the time, and Douglas Ross, the Scottish Tory leader, as well. Early days, isn't it? But do you think that's likely to be the common view of Conservative MPs, or are we now going to see a movement perhaps from those backbenchers who were reserving judgments before news of the fixed penalty notices came out, perhaps moving against him?
I would suspect, though, I might have to come back on and eat my words, Adrian, so please do have me if that's the case. But I would suspect that he's gonna hang on. I think the noises from the Conservative Party over the past few weeks have been pretty unified. That regardless of what happens, to be honest, that they're in support of the Prime Minister. I think a key thing with a political coup is that you need to know who your chosen successor is. And it seems as though Sunak was that person up until the last week. And obviously, he's been dragged into various political scandals, not just the one today. And I think aside from him, there's no clear contender. Liz Truss has been the one who's been rumoured in the past because she's very popular within the Conservative Party membership. But as my colleague Adam Biankov always says, she doesn't necessarily have the support among Conservative MPs. And that's the first crucial step that she's got to pass. She's got to win their support. So I'd say that due to those reasons primarily, we're going to see Boris Johnson in charge. I'd say it's fairly likely at the next election.
Let's bring Mark Wilson into the conversation. Hello, Mark. What do you want to say?
Hello. Yes, on what Sam's just been saying, I have seen a tweet from Grimsby Conservatives saying that he should go now. They think he should go, and I think the proof with a lot of the backbenchers, maybe Red Wall or other MPs, not necessarily obviously the cabinet MPs or anyone specific, particularly to the fore. I think the upcoming local elections. I'm a local councillor in Solihull. We are opposition to a Conservative-led administration, and it will be. I think the proof of the pudding will be how the polls are looking in the lead up to the local elections, and then of course if a lot of Conservative councillors lose their seats, and that'll put probably a little bit of pressure also on backbenchers, in the provinces, if you like, and across the UK. And I think that's where the main proof of the pudding in this, whether they call him to go, that's where it will sit. I think in that sense, they will get jumpy. I've seen that Julian Knight, the Solihull MP, is waiting for some kind of to see how clear it is about the context of the fines or something akin to that. I mean, obviously it's pretty clear what's happened, but I think they're scrabbling around a little bit, and I think there could be a lot more on this. Whether Johnson is forced out from backbenchers, and of course, obviously, local Conservative parties generally, the groups.
Mark, thank you. Sam, one strange thing I've seen, and this was referenced on GB News today, was that a couple of years ago, there was a report in the Times newspaper about Johnson and Sunak having attended a birthday celebration during lockdown. And the GB News presenter suggested that this might be the get out for Johnson and Sunak, because the information about the birthday celebration during lockdown had been shared with the press. And so there was no suggestion at that time of anybody kicking off about it. It was simply reported. And so the idea, at least, is out there from at least one news organisation that supports Johnson, that they had been clear about this, and it was only retrospectively that it became an issue, particularly if the one incident, if they are each only fined for one incident, if it was that birthday party.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say first of all, it's GB News being total muppets as usual. But I think we both know that it's the way that it's written up. You're a lot more experienced than I am, Adrian. But that piece of that nugget of news buried behind the Times paywall. It's not an open platform. The Times really that masses of people will look at, not like the BBC. I think there's it's not surprising that didn't generate public outrage at the time. I'd say a couple of things. I mean, for one thing, we obviously had the Dominic Cummings scandal and his visit to Barnard Castle, which was sort of the first iteration of this saga, and the public outrage over that was very much equivalent to now. So I don't think there's an argument that the public didn't care about it back then, so why are we bothered about it now? I think that obviously the way that it's written up is important, but in terms of the raw facts, when they are disseminated in a fair way to the public, there is anger there. There is very clear anger there. I think that I'm sort of in two minds about whether additional fines will make a difference. I think if it becomes a snowball and we see one every couple of days or one a week, the pressure could really mount on Johnson and Sunak. But I mean, the tempo of it from the Met Police so far, I'm right. I think I'm right in saying this is the second stage. This is the second release of fines, and the first one was a few weeks ago. So it does seem as though they're drip feeding these fines to us, and if it's drawn out over a longer period of time, the media might, many elements of the media, particularly those that are sympathetic to Johnson, might end up losing their focus, especially since the story won't be moving on significantly in the way that it has today. So I think the pace of the Met Police's investigation, has a real impact on the Prime Minister's future.
Safiah, Sam mentions the media there. How do you feel that your cause and your campaign has been reflected more broadly in the media?
In a broad sense, I think that the media have been supportive of us. They have given us a voice, really, where often a lot of the swell of interest comes around news events like this, like the breaking of rules. And there have been so many that there has been an interest in bereaved families' reactions. So I have felt support from the media in that sense. As I say, it's very much kind of concentrated on these rule-breaking activities, which is fine. I think going forward, hopefully this will actually create the pressure, as Sam was saying, that will lead to Boris Johnson's resignation. And it's not like a personal vendetta. It's more just, I really don't think that it's good enough. I think, it's insulting to the intelligence of this country to continuously lie to us at one of the most difficult times in our history, in our recent history. I think it's really important that pressure is kept up by the media, because that obviously creates a taste for the rest of the country and for the people of this country.
Safiah, really appreciate your time today. Thank you. And
Thanks
good luck
much.
with your ongoing campaign. It's been a privilege to speak to you. Thank you. Good luck to you. And thanks also to Sam Bright from Byline Times. Thank you, Sam. Sam's got to get back now to editing the paper edition along with Hardeep Matharu and Peter Jukes and one or two other colleagues, editing the paper edition of the Byline Times, which will now have to be extensively rejigged in the light of this story. But the Byline Times, the monthly newspaper, is paid for by subscribers. Nobody owns it outside of, well, the readers, really. So if you take out a subscription, or even better still, a membership, you're not only helping to support the great journalism of the Byline Times, which is all about reporting without fear or favour, you'll also be supporting the Byline Radio, supporting the Byline Times podcast, and the news-breaking website bylinetimes.com. And that's where you'll find details of how to subscribe. That's bylinetimes.com. Good, honest journalism. Thanks to Sam, thanks to Safiah, thanks to you for listening. We'll be back again with Byline Radio soon, or the Byline Times podcast, where you can listen again. Do follow our Twitter stream at Byline Radio, and we'll let you know as and when we're going live with Byline Radio. Cheers now. See you soon. Bye.